The Ruttenberg lecture was started for a very good friend of Britain, Darrell Ruttenberg, a Chicago lawyer who used to come over here, and he committed to this lecture. He committed a fund for this lecture, and we've had some very distinguished speakers, Dr. Henry Kissinger, Neil Ferguson, Lord Hurd, and so on. And we have it sort of every 2 years or so. And it's really to commemorate Anglo-British, Anglo-American relations and to forward our friendships with America. Now, we're very, very fortunate to have Rory Stewart here tonight, who is going to talk about defence and our position in the world. And he, of course, doesn't need much introduction, as he's very well known indeed, but he's the MP for Penrith and the Borders, and crucially, the chairman of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee. So he's the person we all need to talk to about this important subject. He will now tell us whether Britain is lurching from engagement to isolation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me clearly? Yes. Very good. So a couple of very brief apologies at the beginning. I know I shouldn't begin by apologising, but firstly I managed to have contracted a cold, so I apologise for drinking my cup of tea. Secondly, there is an election coming in 4 weeks, which I hope doesn't mean that I'm pulling my punches, but may mean that I'm not quite as outspoken and offensive as I sometimes am. The other reason to be a little bit shy and embarrassed in front of you is that we have some very, very distinguished people in the audience who know a great deal more about a lot of these subjects than I do. So please take what I'm about to say as hints followed by guesses. This is my attempt to try to get my head around the pickle that Britain finds itself in. And I'm absolutely certain that I have far more problems than solutions. In fact, my whole lecture might be called A Lot of Problems and No Solutions. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation afterwards, where I can be challenged by chiefs of the General Staff and ambassadors to Moscow and Swedish ambassadors and many other people who I can see sitting in the audience. So let me, though, just begin by saying that the basic problem, it strikes me as a relatively new chair of the Defence Committee, is that we are coming to the end of 20 years of intervention, 2 decades really defined by interventions in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're finishing this period in something close to despair. And we're finishing in something close to despair, really, and this is going to be the structure of my argument, because we're facing new types of threats. So an example of that, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, is obviously Russia-Ukraine. Because, secondly, we're facing a multiplicity of concurrent threats. In other words, what we're seeing across northern Nigeria, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq. In other words, not simply one threat at a time, which is what we were planning for in relationship to Afghanistan or Iraq, but many happening at the same time. And finally, because we have blown through our doctrine, we've lost our doctrinal confidence. We've lost our confidence that we really know how to deal with these kinds of situations. We've lost the confidence that we're enshrined in these 2 great theories that really kept us going, certainly for the last decade, which were the theories of counterinsurgency and the theories of state building. Big, big theories in which a lot was invested, in which 1.2 trillion US dollars was spent in Iraq and Afghanistan in pursuit of these theories. The Rand Corporation produced books called The Beginner's Guide to Nation Building. General David Petraeus produced the US Counterinsurgency Manual. You could turn up in Kabul in 2009 and General Stanley McChrystal would tell you that he was knee-deep in the decisive year and he'd be surrounded by 150 defense intellectuals pumping out theories about how we were going to defeat the Taliban and create a credible, effective, legitimate Afghan state. That's very recently, and all of that is now withered on the vine. So, in order to think about this, I suppose we need to start also from the question of Britain. What does Britain do about this world? What does Britain want to do about this world? What can Britain do about this world? In other words, does Britain actually want to be a global power anymore? Or does Britain want to be, as my friend Diane Abbott suggested to me last week, Denmark? Indeed, as Alex Salmond suggests frequently, we want to be Denmark. Does Britain, even if it wants to be a global power, does it actually have the capacity, the resources to do that? And thirdly, even if it wants to be a global power and has the capacity or resources to do that, does it have the doctrine? Does it know what it would do? So what are these threats that we face? And I'm going to break them down into their two very simple components and then try to talk a little bit about the ways in which we might think in terms of Britain dealing with them. Broadly speaking, these threats fall into the Russia-Ukraine threat on the one hand and the kinds of threats represented by what we used to call, in the days of grand jargon, failed states or fragile states or failing states, or what General David Petraeus called global Islamic extremism. Right? There was a great day of this kind of jargon. You could sit there in 2010 and different Washington think tanks could generate different words for these things. But broadly speaking, that second category, which I've described in that grisly jargon word, is a way of trying to talk, I suppose, about northern Nigeria, the Sahel, North Africa, the Horn of Africa, Yemen, the Levant, Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, those kinds of threats. These threats are not what we envisaged in the defense planning assumptions of 1998. They're not the kinds of threats that we envisaged in the national security tapestry of 2010. They're not the kinds of threats that, as recently as the last Strategic Defence and Security Review, we really expected Britain to be dealing with. If you look at those strategies, the big picture, and this is obviously a predictable one that historians in the audience are overly familiar with, is of course that we tend to be fighting the last war. So the big picture behind those previous reviews that created all British force structures was the idea that we would roughly be doing the kinds of things we did in Iraq or Afghanistan. And what does that really mean? Well, that really means, again, in the grisly jargon of the Future Force 2020 structure, it means an enduring stabilization operation at a brigade level in the context of a large, enduring coalition. So what does that really mean? That really means what we did in Afghanistan. That means 100,000 troops on the ground, predominantly American, and us slotting in what used to be 10,000 troops, but in the current planning assumption would be 6,600 troops. That's what all the force generation is based around. And the idea is that you have enough soldiers to be able to keep those 6,600 soldiers on the ground for about a decade, during which time you are fighting a counterinsurgency campaign and you're building a state. What that means you were not doing, and this is the key, what you were not doing is dealing with an advanced military nation at a large scale. You weren't planning to fight a big, complex war against an advanced military nation, on the one hand. Nor were you proposing to engage in collapse of states in a dozen countries simultaneously. In force terms, that means you were neither expecting to operate at a sort of divisional level, nor were you really expecting to operate at a battle group or reinforced company level across a dozen theatres simultaneously. You were really thinking about this funny thing called a brigade, and you were thinking about doing it for a long time. This has been blown out of the water, obviously, because the kinds of threats we face today don't really fit that picture. So let's look at those threats. Russia. Now, Russia is an advanced military nation. Whatever we think about it, and we can come back to whether Russia really is a threat and what kind of threat it is and how we might deal with it, but we have to recognize, firstly, in very blunt planning terms, Russia is not Afghanistan. You're not talking about taking on lightly armed insurgents. You're not talking about taking on guerrillas running around with Kalashnikovs. And that means a number of things. That means you're dealing with a nation that is spending currently just up to about $100 billion a year on defense. That's more than twice as much as we spend on defense. That has serious planes, although perhaps not as serious as our planes. That has some serious ships, or again, maybe not quite as serious as our ships always. That has certainly much more serious tanks than we have. That, for better or for worse, was able in the Zapad 2013 exercise, the end of 2013, to mobilize something like 65,000, 70,000 troops at 72 hours' notice, and is the process of doing that again today. That's investing in upgrading its nuclear weapons arsenal, that flew a nuclear bomber to Venezuela as part of an exercise, that has pretty sophisticated capacity in electronic warfare and jamming, which would cause serious problems for our command and control, and which also showed in Crimea and eastern Ukraine an ability to do something which the Chief of Staff of the Russian Army calls next-generation warfare. I'm sorry, this stuff is also jargony, or we sometimes call ambiguous warfare or asymmetric warfare, which is basically a way of saying cyber attacks, information operations where you create separatist groups and encourage Russian minorities to feel that they're being oppressed and that they should rise up against their government, combined with the use of different forms of special operations, special forces, of which, perhaps one of the most peculiar examples, which you might be aware of in the audience, was the emergence of a key separatist leader in Donetsk, who called himself briefly Igor Strelkov, who turned out to be called a man called Girkin, who was a student at a relatively elite university in Moscow, who then developed a taste for reenactment battles, so he liked to dress up in white Russian uniform and rode around with 1920s artillery. And somewhere in the course of this was picked up in some sort of reserve auxiliary capacity by the Russian intelligence and security services, by the SVR, on whose behalf he eventually became a colonel and went around doing peculiar operations in the Caucasus and in Transnistria, and then pops up as a separatist leader in Donetsk, along with the Interior Minister of Transnistria, who also had reinvented himself as a separatist leader in Luhansk. So that kind of stuff, that's the second area in which Russia operates. So big conventional and this asymmetric next-generation warfare. So let's just, before I move on to almost the more difficult question, which is the Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq question, let's just have a look at that Russian question for a second. Were we in Britain to wish to be serious about dealing with a Russian conventional threat, we would firstly have to work out how we deter it. And that involves a great deal of psychology. That involves not just our capability, not just our willpower, but our sense of what actually is likely to make the Russians feel that the risks involved of action are considerably greater than they expected. And what are we trying to deter? Well, presumably, our primary aim is trying to deter some action against a NATO member state. So what's the very worst case scenario? Well, the worst case scenario, presumably, is Putin rolls some tanks across the border into Estonia, or perhaps he puts a few special forces or people like Igor Strelkov across the border into Latvia, and they just sit in a forest and wait to see what we do. May not need to take a major city, they may just go 2-3 miles across the border and then wait to see what our response is. We assume, and again, these are all assumptions because our intelligence on Putin is pretty bad, our tactical intelligence is pretty bad, but we assume he's a relatively rational person, he's an opportunist, he's not a lunatic, he's making some kind of cost-benefit calculation about risk, and he's going to be looking at us and he's going to try to work out what our response will be. We, of course, like to tell ourselves that the chance of him doing that is a high-impact, low-probability event because it would be flouting Article 5 and it would involve an immediate NATO response. Is that true? Well, of course, during the Cold War, we could assume that it was true that if the Soviet Union were to roll tanks towards Berlin, there would be a response. That's funny because we exercised for that response all the time. I mean, the British put into a single exercise in 1986, we deployed 67,000 soldiers into a single NATO exercise in 1986. Today, we're struggling to deploy a reinforced battle group at the moment into exercise, about 1,000 people instead of 67,000 people. And in that room, planning and exercising, were politicians who were made again and again to go through the thought process of wondering at what point they were going to respond. And people had different roles, and one lot was supposed to be concentrating on Russian submarines, and the RAF were meant to be taking out certain designated airfields, and the US Air Force was meant to be flying through to Moscow, and ultimately, we were supposed to be firing a nuclear weapon at Moscow as a way of responding to them advancing. Today, I suppose we assume that were Putin to go into Estonia, the people of Great Britain would not be very comfortable firing a nuclear weapon at Moscow for fear that Moscow might retaliate. In other words, if you're sitting in Birmingham, you may not be very happy with the idea that in order to protect the people of Estonia, you're about to have a nuclear weapon dropped on your head. So what is it that Russia's going to be looking at? Well, probably not that. And one of the reasons they're not going to be expecting a nuclear response is that we're not communicating even a conventional response very effectively at the moment. I mean, that nuclear deterrent, really in the Cold War, was based on a general idea of broader credibility. An idea that we were pretty tough and that we were prepared to face them down and we were exercising to do that. It sometimes seems from the outside, and again, you know, there are many people in the audience who understand this stuff much better than I do, but it often seems from the outside as though the Russian General Staff is relatively mechanistic and bureaucratic in the way that they assess the capacity and will of NATO countries. You know, there are stories that during the Falklands War they put us up 0.1% on their assessment because they suddenly discovered or suddenly thought that Britain had shown a will or a capacity that they hadn't hitherto anticipated. If they think in terms of divisional maneuvers, if they're thinking in terms of corps level maneuvers, if they're priding themselves on being able to mobilize 60, 70,000 troops at 72 hours notice, it is possible at least that they will be looking to our capacity to do the same thing. They're not going to be very impressed, I suggest, modestly, by the idea that Britain does divisional exercises only on a paper basis, only on a command basis. We just did one recently, but they would actually like to see whether we really can move 14 or 15,000 people around. They'd really like to see how many of our tanks are actually operational. They would be interested in whether we're capable of combining things that we didn't really do in the Cold War, things that I barely understand, but how do you use your tactical drones, intelligence and surveillance, and combine that with all the complicated naval operations, helicopters, planes, and armor? How do we think about ballistic missile defense? We don't have a ballistic missile defense capacity in Britain. We might have to buy into an American system and persuade them to remove it from the continent. How do we think about chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense? Again, anyone in this audience who was in the military up till the early 1990s will have spent a lot of time getting very hot, moving around in a NBC suit with a gas mask on. We haven't really done that for 20 years because the people we've been proposing to fight in Afghanistan or Iraq were not people who were going to do that to us. So we've lost most of that capacity. Nobody exercises in terms of that capacity. Our naval capacity is based, according to a statement in the House of Lords by Lord Astor. He says that we are currently operating on an attrition calculation in the Navy of 0. So we have 19 frigates and destroyers. And the argument being made by the MOD is that we haven't lost a ship since the Falklands War. But of course the Falklands War was the last time we were fighting another navy, so it's not very surprising. I mean, the Taliban are not capable really of sinking one of our ships. But if you're beginning to think about dealing with an advanced military nation like Russia, and I'm talking here about deterrence, I'm not talking about us invading Moscow, I'm talking about us having the kind of wherewithal to communicate deterrence, to communicate that we're serious about defending the Baltic states. Now, it's another question whether or not we should have taken the Baltic states into NATO in the first place, but we've done that. And now we've done that, we have to be serious about defending them. Then you move on to the asymmetric stuff. How do we deal with the Strelkov, the Gherkins, the cyber attacks, the special forces, the information operations? There too, Britain has a challenge. And this is an institutional bureaucratic challenge, which we don't talk about very much. Basically, countries like Russia or countries like America have a much more confident middle ground between their intelligence services, their special operations, their special forces, and their foreign office. We, on the other hand, don't do that. Since SOE was broken away from SIS, from MI6 at the end of the war, we've basically created, on the one hand, the SAS, and on the other hand, SIS. And in between, not much of what the Russian Americans would call special operations. So we don't have paramilitary groups who are under the command of our intelligence services. What we have are people who specialize increasingly on counter-terrorist operations. And to do that, we don't have very many special forces. They have to train very, very hard to be able to do counter-terrorist operations. They need to exercise a great deal on that. And on the other hand, we have people who follow Joint Intelligence Committee requirements in order to collect intelligence on a particular target, generally through single source reporting. If you suddenly said to the British system, and here I'm pushing out of my own department, I'm pushing into another department, but if you were to say to the British system, I really want to know what the risk is to Mariupol at the moment. Are the separatists going to be able to take Mariupol? I really want to understand how good the Ukrainian army are, how fractured they are, how corrupt they are. I really want to understand what these militia groups coming out of Kiev are like. How much training have they really got? I really want to understand how much support there is in the population of Mariupol for the Ukrainian government and how much support there is for the Russians. I want to get some sense of probabilities of whether Russian-backed separatists are likely to be able to make it easily to Odessa. I don't think we at the moment would be in a position to answer that. In fact, I'm pretty sure what you would find is that our defense attaché isn't allowed for force protection reasons to travel far outside Kiev. I'd be pretty certain that the special forces teams that you put in on the ground would be operating at a very tactical level. You might be able to put in a captain or a major who would be lucky to get access to the senior Ukrainian military staff, who might not have the confidence to be able to reach out to the journalists and the politicians in Mariupol, partly because their work is secret and they don't want to be exposed in that kind of way, who wouldn't be able to have the deep country understanding, the linguistic understanding that you would need to build up over 4 or 5 years to really be able to sense what's going on in public opinion on the ground. Which brings me to, before we move on to questions, brings me to the second set of threats, which is threats in an arc really from the edge of Algeria to Pakistan. There too, we need to come to a decision. If we were speaking the truth in 2007, we said that this kind of situation, a failed state, with a large Islamist terrorist-linked group controlling huge amounts of territory, was, in George Bush's words, justifying the surge in 2007, the sum of all our fears. The entire surge, that surge that involved the deployment of 130,000 troops and the expenditure of $140 billion a year, was predicated on the assumption that the idea of al-Qaeda Iraq controlling territory in Western Iraq would be an absolute catastrophe, not just for the regional order, but for the global order. That was why Petraeus was sent there. All that money all those operations were predicated on the assumption that if Al-Qaeda Iraq was allowed to control territory in Western Iraq, we would see the region disintegrating, American power and credibility eroded around the world, and terrorist attacks taking place with ever-increasing frequency. What we now have in Iraq is much worse than anything that was envisioned in 2007. We now have the Islamic State controlling a territory somewhere between the size of the United Kingdom and the size of France, including the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul, including Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, big cities in eastern Syria. We see their affiliate groups springing up. We see 20,000 foreign fighters now deployed there. We see foreign fighters coming not just out of countries like Britain that used to like to beat themselves up. I mean, one of the great phenomena of the period after 2005 was the British beating themselves up and saying, we uniquely generate Islamist terrorists because of some element in our politics, some element in our society. So if you were from the left, you would say, well, the problem in Britain is we generate Islamist terrorists because we don't have enough social justice, we don't have enough equality, these people are not included enough in society. If you were from the right, you said the reason we generate Islamist terrorists is we're not tough enough on them, we're not locking up enough preachers, we're not locking up enough of these guys. We now see, I think, that actually the generation of foreign fighters has almost nothing to do with the political, social, or economic structures of the country from which they come. These people are coming in almost equal numbers from every conceivable political, social, and economic system. They're being generated from Scandinavian countries with fine traditions of equality and social justice. They're being generated from tough European countries like France that insist on a monocultural vision. They're being generated from countries like Britain that didn't insist on the same monocultural vision. They're being generated from countries like Egypt, where a firm military government locks up 5,500 Muslim Brotherhood members. They're being generated from countries like Tunisia, where an Islamist-linked government won an election. They're being generated from monarchical theocracies like Saudi Arabia. They include people who were apple farmers in Normandy. They include Somali Americans from the Twin Cities. It doesn't seem to matter what your income indicators are, what your democratic or monarchical or authoritarian structures are. It doesn't seem to matter whether you're in a country where people are tolerated, whether they're locked up, whether they're included, whether they're allowed to worship, whether they're not allowed to worship. They're being generated. And my argument would be that, unfortunately, the biggest single reason why people are being generated is because of this space which has been allowed to emerge. There is a direct correlation, unfortunately, between that Islamic State and the emergence of those 20,000 foreign fighters. The big difference between 2013, when there were not 20,000 foreign fighters, and 2015, when there are, is not some fundamental change in Islam or some fundamental change in our own social policy. It's simply that the theatre has been created in Syria or Iraq, which can draw a generation of would-be Islamist Che Guevaras to go out and live out their fantasies on the ground. And these territories are now being created in ever more bewildering features. So much so that I began with jargon. And I'm quite interested in jargon. I'm quite interested in the way that these geniuses in the Rand Corporation were talking about countries in the 2000s, because you realize that what we're now looking at is defying every single prediction made by the optimists, by Tom Friedman, by Francis Fukuyama, by any people who are modeling ideas of civil society, governance, the bottom billion, by Hernando de Soto, who was suggesting that all we needed to do was sort out property ownership and mortgages, by development economists and DFID, who were trying to put the focus on microcredit, by any number of attempts to try to create theories about how employment or governance or the rule of law or civil society, I'm just throwing these jargon terms out, would or would not create security, peace, and eradicate terrorism. Let's look at those countries in a little bit more detail. The point is that they're all somehow hosting things that scare us, but they're all quite different in nature. I mean, northern Nigeria is largely a story, I suggest, about the collapse of Goodluck Jonathan's government. It's a story about the collapse of the Nigerian army, and it's a story about an inability to heal a rift between northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria in the 100 years since we stitched those two countries together. Libya was an avoidable problem. I mean, Libya, there ain't no Sunni-Shia divide. Libya is nothing connected to Iraq or Syria. And Iraq is a country with 26, 28 million people. Shia, Sunni, Kurd, none of that exists in Libya. Libya is primarily Sunni. It's a country with decent revenues in a way that Afghanistan doesn't. It's a country where the fundamental problem is we've ended up with two governments, and we've ended up with armed militia groups who are running protection rackets up and down the country. Yemen, I mean, Yemen today, the fact that we find ourselves in a situation where we wake up in the morning and the United States has removed the last of its special forces out of Yemen, and Saudi Arabia has announced that it's mobilized 130,000 soldiers, and it's created a coalition which includes UAE, Bahrain, and even Morocco in airstrikes against an Iranian-backed group that is currently controlling Sana'a. Why weren't we talking about that 5 weeks ago? Why haven't we talked about Libya since our great intervention in 2011? What exactly is our theory in Western Iraq? I want to move towards a conclusion. My conclusion will be this. We cannot walk away. The temptation is going to be to think these places are not threats. The temptation is going to be to say to ourselves, well, maybe we were just deluded in 2007. Maybe actually these things never were existential threats to global security. Maybe actually nothing really is much of a threat to Britain. Russia's not much of a threat to Britain. What's happening in Ukraine doesn't matter much to Britain. What happens in Estonia doesn't matter much to Britain. What happens in Libya doesn't matter much. What happens in Iraq or Syria doesn't matter much. These foreign fighters don't matter much. That's one possibility. But I suspect the reason that we will be saying that is not because of an objective assessment of the threats. I think the threats are very real. It's because of a fear that we can't do anything about it. It's a bit like our calculation that Putin going and causing trouble in the Baltic is a high impact, low probability event. We think it's low probability because it's such high impact. These are forms of wishful thinking. If, however, we are to deal with these countries, we need new thought, we need new doctrine. And that new thought and new doctrine stems from a deep seriousness. It's not something I'm going to be able to provide, or even these very well-informed people in this room are going to be able to provide in the next half an hour of conversation. It is a fundamental rethinking from Britain about the way we talk about other people's countries. It's about rebuilding our institutions. It's about thinking about how we compensate for that enormous gap that's emerged between the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, our intelligence agencies, and our special forces. That question that I posed on how on earth do we find out what's happening in Mariupol. Now, that isn't an impossible thing to answer. The French, for example, have a much more convincing explanation of what's going on in Mali than we do for what's happening in northern Nigeria. Secondly, we may need to think not always about operating in coalition. We may want to think about the fact that perhaps the smartest move we made in the 1960s, when the United States was putting huge pressure on us to go into Vietnam, was to say, we're going to do Borneo. I'll leave you to Vietnam, we're going to do Borneo. It's the same fight, but we're going to do Borneo. That's the French model in Mali. That's the model where you really focus on understanding a country, having the defense engagement, having the links, having the embassies, having the defense attaches, having the political officers on the ground, so that you can move in relatively small number of troops, in that case 1,000 French paratroopers, and have an impact because they know exactly where they're going and what they're doing. We may need to recognize that one of the things that's gone wrong in these big coalition operations is that we abrogate responsibility. We say to ourselves, well, we're only going to operate in coalition again, and we use that as an excuse to not really think hard about what the threats are, what our capacity is, and what we're really going to do. It's a wonderful alibi. I'm afraid often if you pin someone in a corner and you say, what are we doing in Libya? The immediate answer is, well, Britain's not going to do it alone. And what they mean by that is the United States hopefully is going to do it for us, and we don't really need to think about this, and hopefully the Americans will come up with some plan and we'll go behind it. If you were to say to people, what is the mission? What is the strategy in Iraq at the moment? The only people who will give you a convincing answer are the Iranians, the Iraqi government, and the United States. Why is that? And let me just try to talk in more concrete terms. I've been talking in very abstract terms. It's something to do with an attitude we need to rebuild in Britain of actually taking responsibility, of being in control. If you were to turn up in Iraq at the moment, you would probably find, and this is a guess, right? This is just a guess, and I'm being a bit indiscreet here, but it's a guess, that there would be some convincing British person on the ground in Baghdad who would talk about the National Guard. And the idea is that there's going to be a National Guard created, and the National Guard will be a way of getting the Sunni tribal groups to work with the Baghdad government, and this is going to be absolutely terrific, because the key to taking on the Islamic State in Mosul is going to be to wrench the Sunni tribal groups away from the Islamic State and make them work with the Baghdad government. How are we going to do that? We're going to do it through a National Guard. And how does the National Guard work? Well, the National Guard theoretically works in us paying some money to some Sunni tribal groups to fight on our side. And the rough model in the back of the mind of people saying this is something called the Sahwa, the Sunni Awakening. It's what we did in 2007, where we had 120,000 Sunni tribal groups paid to fight on our side against what was then called Al-Qaeda Iraq and is now called Daesh. But if you were to ask General Benderik, who's the American general on the ground, about the National Guard, you'd get a completely different answer. What he would say to you is, Rory, the National Guard, yes, I was on my helicopter yesterday at the Al-Assad Air Base. I met the 237 members of the El Nimr tribe. I realized they had no weapons. I had to phone the Iraqi Minister of Defense, who explained that there were 500 weapons in the armory, but we couldn't get them out. Then I had to contact the National Security Advisor and to get some cash to pay them. And then half of them went absent without leave. Now, at the end of that conversation, I have an idea what this National Guard is. Right? I would conclude, let's say that kind of conversation happened, I would conclude there isn't going to be a National Guard. Probably, if that's what I heard, I'd probably conclude that the Shia government in Baghdad is not very serious about a National Guard, that they actually think the idea of arming and paying Sunni tribal groups is a threat to the Iranian-linked Shia government in Baghdad. They have no intention of paying them regular salaries or cash, and probably when they're talking about a National Guard, what they really mean is some way of paying the Shia militia groups, who are the people that they're really interested in. And therefore, I would probably conclude that there isn't much hope of getting a serious chunk of the Sunni population on your side as you try to go into Mosul. So, my question for the military would be, how do you get me, in the British government, somebody like that on the ground in Baghdad? How do you get me the equivalent of that American general? Somebody with that access, that confidence, who's able to look me in the eye and explain what those 237 people look like. Give me that granular detail. My guess is that it's not just about the fact it's a general. It's not just about the fact he's got a helicopter and can fly up to the Al-Assad Air Base. It's because he feels responsibility. He feels somehow in control. He feels that he owns this. He and every 2- and 3-star American general in the Central Command wants to discuss this stuff, can be challenged, can debate it. It's not like that here. I think what we're lacking is the culture of challenge. I fear that if I was to be aggressive and say, well, what exactly do you think Hadi al-Amri is doing? What exactly is the gap between the Badr Shia militia and the Hezbollah Shia militia? The response that you might get back from the Ministry of Defense at the moment would be a little bit defensive. Whereas in the American system, or in fact, if I was talking, God forbid, but if I was talking to Sardar Qasem Soleimani, who is the Quds commander, the senior Iranian commander on the ground, you would have a very practical, granular discussion about what's going on. We're not able to generate that. The answer then is we need to change the culture of British government. We need to change the culture of our armed forces. We need to change the culture of our Foreign Office. We need to change the culture of our special forces. We need to change the culture of our intelligence services. It needs to begin from humility. It needs to begin from a sense of what we cannot do. It needs to begin from an acknowledgement of failure. But that acknowledgement of failure would be used to rebuild our confidence and our optimism to act elsewhere in the future. The danger of what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan is that we lurch from engagement to isolation, from troop increases to withdrawal, from a sense of omnipotence to a sense of despair, from megalomania to paranoia. Right? This is what I worry about. Not just about Britain, but actually sometimes even about the United States. The way to get through that is to acknowledge that the last 25 years we have got an awful lot wrong. That our structures were not necessarily correct. That the things that we promised, the gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Afghanistan, wasn't going to happen. That the twin objectives that President Obama set in 2009 in Afghanistan, the defeat of the Taliban and the creation of a credible, effective, legitimate Afghan state, were not going to happen. That the counterinsurgency warfare theory was compromised from the beginning because we never controlled the borders, we never had the credible government in Kabul, we never had the support of the local population to make any of that theory operate. But that doesn't mean that we pack up shop, create a Swiss-style military, and think the only threats that we need to worry about is ships turning up at Dover. It means discovering again our genius in Britain, which actually we share to some extent with France. It is, of course, in the end, about flexibility, and it's about energy. It's not about saying to ourselves it's all about resources. I was challenging someone recently on the fact that President Obama had made 10 telephone calls in 2 weeks to Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, the two Afghan leaders. One of the reasons we don't have a civil war in Afghanistan is because of those telephone calls, because John Kerry got on a plane, because the American ambassador, Jim Cunningham, spent 3.5 weeks sitting in a room getting those two people to work together, which is why we do not have a Pashto-Tajik conflict at the moment in Afghanistan. And the immediate answer I get back is, well, the Americans have got more resources than we have. What does that mean? Their phone bill is bigger than us? I mean, it has to be possible for us to find a role which isn't about punching above our weight, which isn't about punching below our weight, which is about really enjoying our inheritance, our heritage, our knowledge of the world, our extraordinary armed forces, our extraordinary Foreign Office, the reputation we still maintain, our position on the Security Council, our leading position in NATO, and to realize that doing this urgently, aggressively, open to criticism, open to debate, admitting what we don't know, admitting, as I will to you, that I have absolutely no idea what on earth we do if the separatists start running towards Mariupol. I have no idea how we sort out northern Nigeria. I simply do not buy into a picture that the French do Mali and we do northern Nigeria. I suspect northern Nigeria may be beyond us. But that I still believe we could have done something in Libya. We could have stopped Yemen getting into the situation it's currently in. We can be doing more in Iraq. And on that note, I want to open up to a debate, questions, challenge, because I think this room represents a lot of what is best about Britain. Thank you very much indeed.
Let's have the first question in the second row.
There is so much to applaud. There is so much to applaud in what you have told us. And I shall pick up only one point, a suggestion. We should treat Putin with much more respect than we have done. And what I find mortifying is that the language of Putin, he speaks a better language than we do. We need Russia as an ally, not as an adversary. I'll leave my card with you, and I mustn't speak more because there will be plenty of people who want to speak.
Thank you, sir. Can I take that as a comment and then maybe move on to another question? But thank you, sir, for taking it forward.
General Jackson.
General Jackson, yeah.
Well, Rory, the machine, very important for those who don't hear as well as they used to, starting with me. Rory, can I echo congratulations on a very lucid and honest analysis of the last, really, the period since the end of the Cold War. A somewhat depressing analysis too. And one could be forgiven for reminding oneself that a certain Roman Empire decided to practice his fiddling skills when all around him was not going too well. To encapsulate, I think, what you've said about the United Kingdom is that we don't do strategy, if we ever did. We were never very good at it, but I don't see we're doing it really at all at the moment. And it's this lack of properly thinking things through, which permeates the whole of this Whitehall place. Perhaps that is encapsulated by the fact that, again, I suspect this election will come to its fruition without a serious debate as part of that process on foreign policy, defence and security. And it really ought to be so. But I fear it won't be. Right, let's fast forward. We've had an election. You may still or still not be a member of the august building just across the road. I'm sure we will be. And we know we're going to get a strategic defence and security review. Now, it seems to me that it's an opportunity, a golden opportunity, to do better than the last time, which was a rush job, and was too constrained by the long fingers of Her Majesty's Treasury as it went on. What we ought to be doing, your exam question, what should be the United Kingdom's role in a troubled, difficult, uncertain world? Start there.
Good.
From that you can deduce the sort of capabilities, both military and other, intelligence, which you made the point, foreign policy. There are many strands. What capabilities does the country need, having decided upon the road? And only then can you start to think, okay, are we willing to afford what that shopping list demands? And no doubt then some sordid negotiations go on. But I'm fed up with politicians who tell me, oh, that's very good, but it's not affordable. Well, let's just dissect on unaffordable. If you want to spend 760 odd billion pounds on the defence budget, it is indeed unaffordable. But that is the extent of government spending, of which defence is around 35. Put it in another context, the interest on the national debt is more than twice what we spend on our defence. And it may be time for a really hard relook at priorities. Now, I'm probably singing into the wind, I suspect, but if you could assure me you will do your level best to raise the intellectual level of the review we're due and do better than last time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, General. So very, very important points there. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about being a politician is that we ought to be more ambitious. I mean, for some reason, being a politician can become synonymous with not spending money, with being very modest in intentions. But in fact, what I've discovered recently as somebody who believes we should be increasing defense spending dramatically, and I produced a little shopping list of what I'd be spending it on. I'd be spending it on ballistic missile defense, CBRN, armored capacity. I'd want a full carrier strike capability, and I can keep going on what I'd spend the money on. But it's very striking how, oddly, the cultural government, both in the MOD and even in the military, keeps looking at me as though I've gone mad and saying, well, be realistic, obviously we're never going to get the money. The same's true of the Foreign Office. I mean, personally, if anyone was deluded enough to elect me as into a position of power, I would double the budget of the Foreign Office. The French, and it's not as crazy as that sounds. I mean, I say this to people in the Foreign Office, they think I've completely lost my marbles, but the French, who have a GDP smaller than ours, spend twice as much as we do on their Foreign Office. Right? The expenditure on the Foreign Office is tiny, less than £1 billion a year. We spend twice as much on the winter fuel allowance as we spend on the Foreign Office. And one of the reasons why there are these huge gaps and we can't get any decent political reporting, and why there are 24 empty pods in the embassy in Baghdad that we're not filling, is that we simply don't have any money. The same with the military. I mean, I think the world is getting more dangerous. In very blunt terms, when the world gets more dangerous, you have to spend more on defense. I mean, it's not a very difficult thing to communicate. And I think the British public understand that. And actually, it's a rather interesting kind of expenditure. I mean, some of this expenditure, of course, is actually jobs in Britain. Some defence expenditure is jobs in Britain. Right? Direct jobs, people who actually employ the military, and direct jobs, people making stuff that the military then use or we sell around the world. I would argue doubling the Foreign Office budget would probably actually bring economic benefit to Britain too. But you're absolutely right, General. We need to be much, much more ambitious. I mean, for example, DFID has 0.7% of GDP dedicated to it, right? So British expenditure on development is about to go through the £14 billion a year mark, when the entire Foreign Office budget is about £1 billion. There's a bit of money. Next question.
Anthony Beaver.
The whole dismal cliche, I think, of the past years of punching above our weight, do not agree that it's time that should be buried, because in many cases it prompted generals perhaps to be more can-do than they perhaps should have been, politicians to be more parsimonious than they should have been, and as a result, many operations were carried out under-resourced and even undermanned on occasions. Is there any hope in the future that commitments, that resources and strategy could actually be married up?
Well, I mean, Anthony's gone to the core of a very, very important question. I mean, punching above your weight is a pretty foolish thing to do. I mean, you really don't want to go into a boxing ring against a big heavyweight boxer if you're a lightweight boxer. It's not a smart thing to do. And the problem with punching above your weight is that it encourages, at its worst, tokenism. It encourages, the worst aspect of it is that actually you're not really punching above your weight, you're simply pretending to punch above your weight. You're beating your chest and you're claiming that you're a major player in a particular operation when you're really a very minor partner in a coalition. I mean, this really, unfortunately, has often been the case. I mean, one of the things that I think has been, one of the things, of course, I like about what happened when we went into Borneo in the 1960s and didn't go into Vietnam is that we could say, okay, the United States is doing Vietnam, and here we are doing something in Borneo, which is actually pretty good in confrontasi terms. That involved regular soldiers, that involved special forces, it also involved the Navy sailing through the Sunda Straits, it involved the Royal Air Force keeping back Sukarno's bombers. And we weren't doing it in the way that we often are at the moment. I mean, I think one of the problems, the United States are incredibly polite people. They're very, very polite people, so they spend a lot of time saying thank you very much for your contribution. But I do sometimes feel, although they're too polite to say it, that some American generals are a little bit perplexed at just how much we seem to be boasting about what we're doing when they are aware that we are a relatively minor component on the ground of the operations that they're conducting. So I desperately want us to get out of that. I desperately want us to be honest about what we're doing and what we're not doing. I mean, nothing makes me more depressed than... I'm being a bit unfair here, but I mean, there's a slight tendency for us to... Maybe I'm being very unfair. I mean, I don't know anything about this at all, but when I sit in Russi and I'm at the Anglo-Japan Defence Conference and I hear about the fantastic new defence alliance that we've created with the Japanese, I really want to know exactly how many people is that? You know, what are we really committing there? When I hear that we've got a very high readiness joint task force coming together for NATO, I would be quite interested in knowing whether those 5,500 people are the same people that we've also committed to a joint expeditionary force with the French, and the same people that we've put into a joint expeditionary force with NATO, or whether they're actually an additional capacity. I mean, I'm being a bit mean here, but I mean, I think that's the challenge for Britain. I think we need to get a bit more, and it's not just for the Ministry of Defence. I'm being a bit mean to the Ministry of Defence, but I mean, the same, unfortunately, is true with the Foreign Office. I mean, when I was doing, on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, I asked a very distinguished senior diplomat what resources, what extra resources we'd put into Syria. And he said, dozens of people. And I said, well, okay, how many people in the senior management stream have you contributed? He said, 2 or 3. So I said, well, except for John Wilkes, who have you contributed? And he said, well, only John Wilkes. So I said, well, so that's 1 in the senior management stream. How many at D7 level? And he said, I think 1. And how many at D6 level? 1. So the answer was, there were 3 fast-stream diplomats who'd been committed to Syria. Well, we were talking quite a big game on Syria. So I think our weight at the moment is not as great as we sometimes pretend, and we certainly shouldn't be trying to punch above it.
Yes, in the suit.
The narrow question in terms of a lecture title was the relationship between the Anglo-American conjunction. Now, those of us on the centre-right have always broadly interpreted America as being our major ally. And I know you've partially answered, replied to this question, to the previous question, but how do you see that relationship developing now that a democratic government there seems to look beyond the Europe as its primary cause of interest?
Well, I think there are a lot of very interesting questions. I mean, this is absolutely central. Obviously, my talk is predicated on the assumption that the United States, for all its flaws, has an extremely impressive defense and foreign policy machine. That one of the things that's so wonderful about dealing with the United States is I feel if I give a lecture at Fort Leavenworth, people can take criticism, they reform, they learn, they're pumping out generals who are going off and doing very interesting things. I think people like Petraeus and McChrystal are extraordinary people. I really enjoy dealing with the American machine. I often feel that simply stepping off a plane in Washington, I have an immediate sense of what's happening in Yemen or Sudan in a way that I don't in Britain. John Kerry, for example, when you talk to him, it is extraordinary how confident he is talking in detail about 32 different countries, how well he is briefed, how much he wants to know. But America is not playing as active a role in the world as it was. It's pretty peculiar. I mean, take today. Today, 120 American special forces have been withdrawn out of Yemen. The American embassy in Yemen was closed months ago. And instead, the United States has stepped aside and allowed a coalition of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, Morocco to launch itself to Yemen. effectively against an Iranian-backed group, and the United States is staying out. Libya. It's tragic what happened to the American ambassador in Benghazi, but it's a pity that we've ended up in a situation where we have one government in Tripoli, one in Tobruk, and nobody's managed to even stop the Libyan central bank paying salaries to all these armed militia groups. And America, as you say, is keen to tilt towards the Pacific, is anxious about this fact that it's now spending 70% of NATO spending, is very aware that Germany is down to 7 tank battalions. Britain is down to something similar. The French have got rid of most of their armoured capacity. So when American striker units go rolling into the Baltic, they're feeling pretty lonely. And part of the story I'm telling is a story about the rest of us stepping up. You know, we're talking about whether we can keep up at 2% of GDP. America's spending 4.5%, 5%. And they're being serious. I mean, I saw the American Deputy Chief of Staff, and he was saying to me that he was anxious that the defense cuts in the United States might mean that they might not be able to focus as much on Africa as he'd like. Whereas we continue to talk in this country as though we can focus on 200 countries simultaneously, when the entire size of our armed forces is less than the amount of people in the United States is currently laying off. They're laying off 120,000 soldiers. So that's central. And I'd really like to see us step up and be a little more serious. And part of that is because we're not going to be able, I suspect, over the next 20, 30 years, to just assume that America's somehow going to be sorting all this stuff out.
I think we're almost done. One more.
Oh, and there's also
second last. Okay.
Can I take 2 at a time?
On the right, yeah.
I'll
And
take
then,
2, yeah.
You,
sir, and then Jonathan.
Right from you.
Well, you've spiked both questions I had, but could I come back? As an American, could I ask you to follow on your comments that you talked about how surprised we have been about the way the world's gone. To what extent are these surprises due to the passive role that Obama has taken over the last several years? Because I think in past times we might have expected a different reaction and therefore a different situation. And the second quick question is, what can be done to get this phobia of the 0.7% changed in government? I mean, it's just extraordinary how that is affecting so many aspects of our expenditure.
Okay, Jonathan.
Thank you for a wonderfully stimulating lecture. I wonder if I could draw you out on how the ambitious Stewart doctrine might be a little bit hopeful as applied to the current war in the Yemen, which sounds unlikely at first hearing, but if the Saudi Air Force are doing as powerful as they are, partly if not substantially because it's largely been British trained, British equipped, right? Secondly, these small Gulf nations which we haven't paid very much attention to, like the UAE, have actually again been well British trained, and I think it's fair to say that our SIS contribution to thinking in the Gulf has been of a perhaps more influential quality than many people know. And coming to your, I think was one of your themes, that we should perhaps, rather like the French, say we're going to specialise in some areas. That's not necessarily obviously, but quite effectively. I just wonder whether you see any hopeful lessons from what's going on in Yemen.
Right, okay, two big questions. Hopeful lessons for what's going on in Yemen. So let me try to deal with the full Middle Eastern picture. I think there is a lot that Britain has done in the Middle East. We do have, as you said, very, very deep connections into all those armed forces. As you say, SIS has done a lot in the Middle East. But it is quite striking what a falling off there's been. I would probably suggest, if I was being frank, that we've become overly reliant on SIS for links into these places. I think that if you contrast again the French, I don't know why the French have become my great heroes at the moment, but you know, if you look at a French defense attaché and compare it to one of our defense attachés, so you take the French defense attaché who was in Libya, he is somebody who did a year's Arabic language training, 2 years at the Egyptian Defense Academy, 3 years as the defense attaché in UAE, 3 years as the defense attaché in Cairo, and then is moved to the defense attaché in Libya. Our defense attaché is not like that. They don't have those kind of career structures. They don't have that kind of knowledge. We have talked up our presence in Bahrain, but it isn't maybe as great as it seems at first glimpse what we're really doing there. The French, of course, have in UAE a squadron of planes, and they have a battalion of the French Foreign Legion in Abu Dhabi, permanently. I mean, that's real defense engagement. And my experience, I mean, you know the Middle East much better than me, but my experience is that most of the people I see in the Middle East are asking for more British involvement, feel a little bit disappointed and perplexed by their sense that France seems to be engaging more, that Putin, they feel, even though they dislike what he's doing in Syria, they at least understand what he's doing in Syria. I mean, there's a sort of rather odd thing going on where you sometimes feel in Saudi Arabia, although they are completely on the other side in the Syrian conflict, they have some sort of sneaking respect for Putin's attitude towards Bashar al-Assad. And, you know, we're in a situation where we now have, as the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee just pointed out, only 2 ambassadors out of 15 in the Middle East who can speak Arabic. Yeah, I don't think we should pat ourselves on the back too much. And I think if we were serious about getting into the Middle East, we'd have to rebuild quite a lot of capacity. On Obama, I mean, it's a terrible situation he's found himself in. I feel deeply, deeply sympathetic towards him in some ways. I mean, it is absolutely true, and he would be right in saying that we over-intervened, that we promised that we could do things that we couldn't do, that we created a pretty considerable series of messes in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we put far too many troops into a country like Afghanistan in a way that wasn't justified by its strategic importance. So I can see why he's recoiling, why the pendulum swung, in a sense, too far back in the other direction. I mean, he would look quite rightly at Afghanistan and say, what on earth did people think they were doing? I mean, why did that country justify 120,000 troops? I mean, if you're worried about terrorism, Pakistan is more important. If you're worried about regional stability, Egypt or Syria is more important. If you're worried about poverty, Sub-Saharan Africa is more important. Why are all our eggs in that basket? Right? So you can see why he is suspicious. You can see why every time he sits down with a general now, he goes, and what then, and what then, and what then, trying to force them to think through the consequences and the logic of the actions. At the same time, you're also right that a policy of doing nothing doesn't seem to have been any more successful than a policy of doing too much. Doing nothing in Syria and Iraq has not allowed the situation to sort itself out. Libya is perhaps a really good example of this. I can understand fully why he felt after the airstrikes, we don't want to get into a big nation-building operation in Libya. If we go into a big nation-building operation in Libya, we might promote an Islamist insurgency and a civil war and a state collapse and this, that, and the other. But guess what? Doing nothing, we've ended up with all those things anyway. I can see why we feel that in Iraq, going into Iraq led to a situation of civil war and chaos and horror. But guess what? Not going into Syria, and we have a situation of civil war, chaos, and horror. Now, part of this must be not the United States' fault. Part of this is that it's in the structure of these people's regimes. It's in the structure of Gaddafi. It's in the structure of Saddam Hussein. It's in the structure of Bashar al-Assad that these things are inherently unstable, that these kinds of autocratic and often sectarian dictatorships carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. That the left, who say that the whole reason that there's chaos in Libya and Iraq is because we toppled these guys, have to tell me why there's chaos in Syria, and why at the same time they're criticizing us for not acting in Syria. Right? Clearly these guys, at some point, they come to an end. Who knows if we'd not intervened in Libya, whether what was happening in Benghazi wouldn't have eventually led to the toppling of Gaddafi anyway, whether that whole regime wasn't crumbling without our airstrikes and we wouldn't have ended up in the same chaos. And I have to believe, and this is what I'm going to finish on, I have to believe that the United States and Britain can, over time, modestly and with humility, create a situation in which we lower the likelihood of civil war and increase the probability of political settlement in countries like Libya and in countries like Afghanistan. That it's not a question of doing too much or doing nothing. That there are places, Sierra Leone, Mali, and what I'm going to finish on, Bosnia, which suggest that intervention can work. We must cling on to this. Now, finish with Bosnia, because Bosnia is very unfashionable at the moment. Bosnia is where everybody says Bosnia is a mess, Bosnia is corrupt, Bosnia is where they're burning down mayoral offices. But Bosnia is the kind of success we need.